In the sodden summer of 1925, near the town of Avonches in western Switzerland, a farmer named Luc Favre was clearing a field that had stubbornly resisted the plow for generations. His family had worked this land since before the cantons were unified, and the earth was stingy, full of Roman field stones and the ghosts of forgotten legions. On a Tuesday choked with humidity, his spade struck something that was not stone. It gave a dull, metallic clink. Favre, expecting a rusted harness buckle or a discarded pot, dug around the object with practiced care. What he unearthed was a puzzle. It was a hollow cage of bronze, no larger than his fist, with 12 flat pentagonal faces. From the center of each face erupted a small, spherical knob. The object was strangely light, its patina a mottled green and brown from centuries spent in the acidic soil. Favre turned it over in his calloused hands, peering through the circular holes on each face, which varied in diameter. It was a beautiful, useless thing. He took it home, washed it in the basin, and set it on his mantelpiece, where it sat for a decade as a conversation piece before a visiting antiquarian purchased it for a few francs. This was not the first such discovery, nor would it be the last. Over the next century, more than 120 of these objects would surface, scattered across what was once the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. From the windswept fields of Wales to the dense forests along the Rhine and Danube rivers. They were found in Roman villas, in military camps, and buried in coin hoards, yet not a single contemporary Roman text ever mentioned them. Pliny the Elder, who seemed to document everything, was silent. They became known as Roman Dodecahedrons, a name that described their shape but offered no clue to their purpose. The academic world, which abhors a vacuum, rushed to fill it with theories. They were proposed as candlesticks, the knobs holding wax tapers in place. But the varied hole sizes made this impractical, and no wax residue was ever found. They were suggested as surveying instruments, or grome, for determining angles on a landscape. Yet their imprecise construction and lack of any discernible markings made them useless for accurate measurement. Some argued they were scepter heads, decorative finials for a staff of office, but their distribution seemed too random, found as often in a common soldier's barracks as in the ruins of a wealthy estate. Others claimed they were children's toys, or perhaps a form of die for a game long lost to time. But the uneven weighting of the knobs and the non-uniform holes made them poorly suited for any game of chance. One of the more peculiar theories suggested they were knitting aids for creating the fingers of Roman gloves, with each knob used to anchor a loop of yarn. Each theory was debated, tested, and ultimately found wanting. The dodecahedrons remained stubbornly enigmatic, artifacts without a context, questions cast in bronze. They were the quiet jesters of Roman archaeology, mocking the neat categorizations of history from their velvet-lined museum drawers. In the late 1930s, a professor at the University of Cambridge, Alistair Finch, became obsessed. Finch was a man of immense intellect but little patience for the rigid orthodoxies of his field. He saw patterns where others saw randomness. He spent years meticulously documenting the find locations of every known dodecahedron, plotting them on a vast map of the Roman Empire that covered the entire wall of his study. He noted their concentration along the limes, the heavily fortified borders, particularly in Gaul and Germania. He measured the angles of the pentagonal faces, the diameters of the holes, and the relative sizes of the knobs. He posited a radical theory, one that was met with derision by his colleagues. He claimed they were not tools, but astronomical calculation devices. He argued that by sighting a star through two of the opposing holes, one could determine specific dates of the year, perhaps for the optimal sowing of crops. Finch's hypothesis was his life's work. He spent his family's inheritance funding expeditions and purchasing access to museum collections. He argued that the different hole sizes corresponded to different stellar magnitudes, and the knobs were used to stabilize the device on a calibrated surface. The problem was, he could never make it work. His models were inconsistent. The mathematics refused to align with the known celestial calendar. His peers, led by the formidable Sir Julian Woolley of the British Museum, publicly dismantled his research. They pointed out that a simple sundial was more accurate. They labeled his work as pseudo-science, a romantic fantasy born of a desire to find genius in the mundane. Finch, unable to provide conclusive proof, was professionally ruined. His funding dried up, his publications were rejected, and his lectures were empty. He lost his tenure at Cambridge and retreated into obscurity, a bitter man haunted by a bronze puzzle. Alistair Finch died in 1952, his grand theory relegated to a footnote in the history of archaeological follies. His life became the human cost of the mystery, a career sacrificed at the altar of an unknown purpose. The dodecahedrons, indifferent to the life they had broken, continued to be unearthed, each one a fresh insult to historical certainty, each one a silent guardian of its secret. For another 70 years, they sat in the quiet, climate-controlled darkness of museum archives. They were catalogued, photographed, and occasionally loaned out for exhibits on Roman mysteries. They were curiosities, nothing more. They were pieces of a puzzle with no picture on the box, a language with no Rosetta Stone. They waited. They were bronze, they were hollow, and they were patient. They had been waiting for nearly 2,000 years. Their time of silence was drawing to a close. History was about to be presented with a bill for its long-held assumptions, and the price of understanding would be the comfortable and predictable reality the world had been built upon. The farmers and soldiers who had first held them could never have known what they touched, what sleeping potential lay dormant in the metal. They saw a strange cage of bronze. They had no way of knowing they were holding a key, and that the lock was the sky itself. 200 hours. Very Large Array Control Center, Socorro, New Mexico. Dr. Lena Petrova stared at the waterfall display, the soft green cascade of data scrolling down the monitor. It was her third consecutive 20-hour shift, and the recycled air of the control room tasted of ozone and stale coffee. For 6 days, they had been tracking a ghost. It was a faint, coherent signal, a whisper buried deep in the cosmic background noise at the 142 gigahertz hydrogen line. SETI protocols had flagged it automatically, but it wasn't from deep space. The parallax was all wrong. Triangulation placed its origin somewhere inside the solar system, but drifting, without a clear orbital path. It was impossible. Every satellite, every probe, every piece of classified military hardware, they had accounted for all of them. This signal, designated LGM-2 for Little Green Men 2, was an anomaly that refused to be debunked. Petrova rubbed her eyes, feeling the familiar grit of exhaustion. Her job was to find the mundane explanation, to be the person who traced the grand mystery back to a faulty microwave oven in the observatory's break room. But LGM-2 was different. It was structured. It wasn't a message, but it had a clear mathematical architecture. It was a complex waveform that repeated on a prime number cycle, a classic sign of artificiality. But its most baffling quality was its geometric resonance. When plotted in 3 dimensions, the signal's polarity shifts traced the vertices of a perfect dodecahedron. It was a piece of data that felt less like physics and more like philosophy, and it was giving her a migraine. Her console chimed, a sharp, intrusive sound in the cathedral-like quiet of the room. It was a Priority 1 encrypted summons from the site director. A car was waiting for her. No details were provided, just a flight number and a destination she had never heard of. Aviano Air Base, Italy. When she arrived at the small, private terminal, 2 people were waiting for her on the tarmac beside a sleek, unmarked Gulfstream jet. The first was a man in a rumpled tweed jacket, his gray hair a chaotic halo around a face etched with weary intelligence. He introduced himself as Dr. Eris Thorne, a historical consultant from Oxford. The second was a woman whose posture was so ramrod straight it seemed to defy gravity. She wore a severe black pantsuit that did little to hide the athletic frame beneath. Her name was Major Eva Rostova, and her handshake was like a closing vice. "Dr. Petrova," Rostova began, her voice devoid of warmth or preamble. "You've been tracking an anomalous signal. We believe it is related to a matter of national security." "I believe it's a sensor reflection off a piece of undiscovered Kuiper Belt debris," Petrova countered, her skepticism an ingrained defense mechanism. "The geometry is likely an artifact of our filtering algorithm." Thorne smiled, a faint, knowing expression. "An algorithm that produces a perfect platonic solid? That's quite the software bug, Doctor. I published a paper 6 years ago, in a rather obscure journal. In it, I mapped the find sites of certain Roman-era artifacts and correlated them with ley lines and ancient surveying points. The resulting energy grid, purely theoretical of course, formed a geodesic sphere. The primary nodes of that sphere, they formed a dodecahedron." Petrova stared at him. "You can't be serious. You're connecting a radio signal to Roman artifacts?" "The signal's geometry is not an artifact, Dr. Petrova," Rostova cut in, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It is a match, a one-to-one correlation. We are assembling a team to investigate the possibility that these objects are not what history believes them to be. You are the engineer who will tell us if they are machines. Dr. Thorne is the historian who will tell us how they work. I am here to ensure that whatever we find does not leave the room. Get on the plane." The flight was tense and mostly silent. Petrova read the file Rostova provided. It was thin on data and heavy on speculation, filled with Thorne's theories, which read to her like academic fantasy. The core of the plan was insane. Under the guise of a metallurgical study for UNESCO, they had gathered 12 of the finest preserved dodecahedrons from museums in London, Bonn, Geneva, and Rome. They were being transported to a decommissioned NATO listening post buried deep in the Italian Dolomites, a place called Site Cassandra. It was a relic of the Cold War, shielded by a kilometer of solid rock, electronically isolated from the outside world. The perfect place to conduct an experiment you didn't want anyone to know about. They landed at Aviano and were transferred to a black, windowless helicopter that beat its way east into the jagged, snow-dusted peaks. The mountains rose around them like teeth, swallowing the sky. The landing pad was carved into the side of a cliff, disguised as a geological survey station. A blast door, thick enough to withstand a direct nuclear strike, hissed open, revealing a tunnel that descended into the mountain's heart. The air that washed over them was cold and sterile, smelling of concrete and dormant machinery. Site Cassandra was a tomb, a place of forgotten fears. The main laboratory was a vast, circular chamber at the base of a central silo. Cables as thick as a man's arm snaked across the floor, feeding power to consoles and equipment that had been newly installed. In the center of the room, on a raised, non-conductive platform, sat 12 pedestals. And on each pedestal, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a Roman dodecahedron. They looked small and unimpressive under the harsh halogen lights, like museum pieces accidentally delivered to a particle accelerator. Petrova felt a surge of profound absurdity. This was a colossal waste of time and resources, a wild goose chase initiated by a historian's fantasy and a military's paranoia. "My equipment is ready," she said, her voice flat. She had requisitioned a suite of non-invasive diagnostic tools, a variable frequency eddy current array, a quantum tunneling magnetometer, and a terahertz band resonant scanner. She would scan these bronze toys, prove they were nothing more than inert chunks of ancient metal, and then she could go home and find the real source of LGM-2. "The arrangement?" Rostova asked, turning to Thorne. Thorne unfurled a large, hand-drawn star chart. It was a mirror image of the northern celestial hemisphere. "The original find sites were not random. I believe they correspond to the brightest stars visible from the northern latitudes in the 2nd century. Aldebaran, Capella, Vega, Deneb. Each dodecahedron is a proxy. We must place them in the correct corresponding positions to form the array." He moved from pedestal to pedestal, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the position of each artifact, consulting his chart and muttering the ancient star names like an incantation. Petrova watched, her arms crossed, the pragmatic engineer observing a ritual she could not comprehend. Rostova stood by the sealed entrance, her hand resting near the sidearm, holstered beneath her jacket, her eyes missing nothing. The air in the chamber grew still, heavy with the weight of 2,000 years of silence and the nervous energy of the 3 people who were about to break it. Aero 900 hours. The command deck. Site Cassandra. The dodecahedrons sat in their star-forged circle, silent and inert. Dr. Lena Petrova ran a final diagnostic on her scanning rig, the displays showing a clean baseline. Everything was nominal. Everything was normal. "All right, Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "They're arranged according to your star map. I'm starting with a basic materials analysis, a multispectrum metallurgic scan. It will confirm the bronze composition and tell us if there are any hidden impurities. It should take about 90 seconds. She initiated the sequence, and a low hum filled the air as the emitters powered up. On the main screen, a 3D model of the central dodecahedron, the one from Geneva representing Polaris, resolved into view. Lines of text scrolled beside it, confirming the expected alloy. Roughly 80% copper, 10% tin, with trace amounts of lead and zinc. It was a standard, unremarkable composition for the period. "See?" Petrova said, a hint of vindicated weariness in her tone. "It's just bronze. Well made, but completely ordinary." "Now try stimulating it," Thorne urged, his eyes fixed on the artifacts. "Use the signal. Broadcast a low-power duplicate of the LGM-2 waveform directly at the array." "That's not standard procedure," Petrova countered. "You scan passively first, introducing an active energy source." "We are far beyond standard procedure, Doctor," Major Eva Rostova interjected from her position by the wall. Her voice was cold steel. "Do as he says." Petrova clenched her jaw, but complied. She keyed in the commands, isolating the LGM-2 frequency and routing it through a directional emitter aimed at the center of the array. She started the broadcast at minimal power, just a few milliwatts. "Emitter is active," she announced. For a moment, nothing happened. The readouts remained stable. The dodecahedrons sat, unmoved. Petrova allowed herself a small internal sigh of relief. This would all be over soon. Then a single sensor on her console blinked from green to yellow. It was the quantum magnetometer. "I'm getting a slight magnetic field fluctuation," she reported, leaning closer to the screen. "Probably interference from the emitter coil." She adjusted the filters to compensate. The fluctuation didn't disappear. It grew stronger. A low, resonant tone began to emanate from the platform, a sound so deep it was felt in the bones more than it was heard. It was the sound of a vast bell struck miles away. "Increase the power," Thorne breathed, his face alight with a terrifying mixture of excitement and awe. "I advise against that," Petrova said, her knuckles white on the console. "The field is growing exponentially. It's not linear. That's not how electromagnetism works." "Doctor, increase the power," Rostova commanded. Petrova complied, her hands moving with a reluctance that bordered on insubordination. She nudged the emitter's output up by 5%. The low hum intensified, rising in pitch until it was an audible, throat-catching thrum. The halogen lights in the laboratory flickered once, then twice. On her main screen, the metallurgical analysis began to glitch. The data for the bronze alloy composition was flashing, numbers shifting impossibly. The tin content was dropping, while an unidentifiable element with an atomic weight that didn't exist on the periodic table began to appear in its place. It was not a machine. "Shut it down," Petrova snapped, reaching for the emergency cutoff. "The alloy it's changing. Its quantum state is unstable. This is impossible." The material wasn't just bronze. At room temperature, under the influence of a specific resonant frequency, its crystalline lattice was reconfiguring. It was becoming a superconductor. Before she could hit the switch, Rostova's hand clamped down on her wrist. "No, I want to see what it does. Keep going." "Major, you don't understand," Petrova pleaded, her voice rising with the first notes of panic. "The laws of physics are starting to unravel in that circle. This isn't technology as we know it." "That is precisely why we are here," Rostova said, her grip unrelenting. "Push it to 50%. Thorne, seemingly oblivious to the struggle, was pointing at the dodecahedrons themselves. "Look," he shouted over the growing noise. A faint, blue-white light was beginning to bleed from the circular holes in the artifacts. It wasn't a reflection. It was an internal luminescence, as if a tiny star had been ignited within each bronze cage. The light pulsed in perfect sync with the LGM2 waveform. The air in the room grew cold, a sudden, shocking drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the facility's climate control. Frost began to form on the surface of the pedestals. Petrova, forced by Rostova, increased the power. At 50%, the world broke. The humming sound became a deafening roar. The blue light erupting from the artifacts intensified, casting sharp, geometric shadows that danced on the walls of the circular chamber. The primary monitor displaying the LGM2 signal went haywire. The incoming signal from space, the one they had been tracking for a week, was gone. It hadn't just disappeared. It had been consumed. "Where's the signal?" Rostova demanded, finally releasing Petrova's wrist. Petrova frantically typed at her console, her mind struggling to process the flood of impossible data. "It's not gone," she stammered. "The array, it's absorbing it. The dodecahedrons aren't just resonating with the signal. They're drawing it in. They're a focusing lens, a gravity well for a specific frequency of radiation." She pulled up a new display, mapping the energy flow. The 12 artifacts were acting as nodes, pulling the faint, diffuse LGM2 signal from space and concentrating it into a single, terrifyingly powerful point in the exact center of the array. The air above the platform began to shimmer, distorting like a heat haze. The lights in the facility went out, plunging them into darkness. A split second later, the emergency backup generators kicked in, casting the room in the stark, clinical red of emergency lighting. Alarms began to blare, a panicked, synthetic scream. "Containment breach!" a computerized voice announced from the ceiling speakers. "External magnetic field has exceeded safety parameters. Lockdown initiated." The massive blast door they had entered through slammed shut with a percussive final boom. They were trapped. "What's happening?" Thorne yelled, his academic curiosity finally giving way to raw fear. Petrova looked at her monitor, her face illuminated by its red glow. The energy level in the center of the array was spiking off the scale. The dodecahedrons were no longer just focusing the external signal. They were drawing power from the bunker itself, pulling electricity directly from the conduits in the walls. They were feeding. And they were preparing to do something. The shimmering distortion in the center of the array was coalescing, tightening into a point of blinding light. "It's not a communications device," Petrova said, her voice a whisper of dawning horror. She finally understood. The skepticism, the search for a rational explanation, had shattered against the rocks of an impossible truth. Alistair Finch hadn't been a fool. He had just been thinking too small. Thorne had been right about the star map, but he had misinterpreted the intent. "This isn't a map," she said, turning to the others, her eyes wide with terror and awe. "It's a gun." The point of light in the center of the array stabilized, a miniature sun held captive by the ancient bronze cages. It pulsed with contained energy, a silent, terrifying promise of power. The dodecahedrons were no longer passive artifacts. They were active components in a machine whose purpose was becoming horrifically clear. The alarms continued to blare, a soundtrack to the end of their understanding of the world. The room was cold, the air was thin, and the three of them were locked inside a mountain with a 2,000-year-old weapon that was beginning to wake up. They had breached the walls of history and found something waiting on the other side. And it was not friendly. 1100 hours. Command deck. The miniature sun in the center of the array pulsed with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The deafening roar had subsided into the same deep, resonant hum they had first heard, but now it was laced with a high-frequency whine that drilled into their teeth. The red emergency lights painted everything in shades of blood and shadow. "Talk to me, Petrova." Major Eva Rostova's voice was strained, but the core of command was still there. "What is the status of that thing?" Dr. Lena Petrova's fingers flew across the keyboard, her face a mask of intense concentration. The system was feeding her data that defied her entire education in physics. "It's stabilized," she reported, not looking up. "The power draw has leveled off. It's pulling a steady 20 megawatts directly from the station's geothermal core. The dodecahedrons are acting as phase conjugate mirrors, but for a form of energy I can't identify. They're not just focusing the LGM2 signal, they're using it as a blueprint, a targeting solution." "Targeting what?" Dr. Eris Thorne asked, his voice shaky. He had backed away from the console and was standing near the wall, as far from the glowing array as he could get. His historical fascination had been replaced by the primal fear of a man who had read a forbidden book and found that it was reading him back. Petrova rerouted the station's deep space sensor feeds, bypassing the fried VLA connection and linking directly to the orbital arrays. She used the geometry of the dodecahedron array as a key, instructing the system to look where the machine was looking. The screen resolved into a patch of sky in the constellation Ophiuchus. It was black, empty space, sprinkled with the faint, distant light of background galaxies. "There's nothing there," she said. "It's aiming at an empty sector just beyond the Oort cloud." "The signal is coming from there," Rostova stated. "It must be." "No," Petrova corrected. "The signal is diffuse, almost ambient. The array is what's giving it a vector. It's like seeing a shape in the static on a television screen. The static is everywhere, but the dodecahedrons are programmed to recognize one specific pattern within it and lock onto it." She initiated a gravimetric analysis, a scan that looked for mass instead of light. The system chugged for a moment, processing the complex request. Then a shape began to resolve on the screen. It was faint, a ghost in the machine, but it was undeniably there. A vast, elongated object, hundreds of kilometers long, sitting in the darkness, utterly non-reflective, absorbing all light and radiation. It was cloaked, it was silent, and it was moving. Its trajectory indicated it would intersect Earth's orbital path in approximately 900 years. "My God," Thorne whispered. "It's a ship." "It's a threat," Rostova corrected, her eyes narrowing. "And this is a planetary defense system. The Romans didn't build it, they found it. They were its custodians." As if in response to her words, a new element appeared on Petrova's main display. Overlaid on the energy readings was a sequence of symbols. They were not numbers she recognized, but Thorne gasped. "That's Roman duodecimal notation," he said, rushing back to the console. "It was a base 12 system used by their engineers and surveyors. It's a countdown." He quickly translated the symbols. "It's counting down from 144. It's at 97, 96. "A countdown to what?" Petrova asked, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "To firing," Rostova answered. Her fear had been replaced by a chillingly calm sense of purpose. "We've armed it. By feeding it power, we've initiated an automated firing sequence." "We have to shut it down," Thorne insisted. "We don't know what will happen when it discharges. The energy backlash alone could create an extinction-level event. Or it could neutralize an encroaching threat before it gets here," Rostova shot back. "This system was built for a reason. Its builders must have known the risks. This is its purpose." "We can't make that decision," Petrova argued, her voice rising. "We've been at this for a few hours. This weapon has been waiting for millennia. We have no idea what the rules of engagement are. For all we know, that ship is a peaceful survey vessel, and this thing is a doomsday device set with a hair trigger." A new set of symbols appeared on the screen, this time a complex geometric diagram that unfolded like a flower. It was a schematic. It showed the energy beam originating from the array, but it also showed a secondary effect. The discharge would open a temporary, localized wormhole, a spatial rift, to deliver the payload directly to the target's location. The beam wouldn't travel through space. It would bypass it entirely. The theoretical physics of it made Petrova's head swim. It was elegant, terrifying, and utterly alien. But the schematic also showed the instability. The backlash Thorne feared was real. The model predicted a 73% chance that the wormhole's collapse would release a gamma-ray burst directly into the upper atmosphere. 73%, Petrova said, her voice barely a whisper. "We'd be trading a potential threat 9 centuries from now for a guaranteed catastrophe in," she glanced at the countdown, 68 minutes. Rostova's face was a stone mask. Petrova could see the war behind her eyes, the soldier's duty to neutralize a threat versus the human's instinct for survival. "Protocol is clear," Rostova said, her voice strained. "Unknown contacts with hostile capabilities must be engaged." "That isn't a contact. It's a sensor ghost 900 years away. And this isn't a tank. It's a planet killer we don't understand," Petrova yelled. "I'm shutting it down." She reached for the command interface to initiate a power dump to the geothermal core. The click of a pistol's safety being disengaged was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Petrova froze. She turned slowly to see Rostova holding her sidearm, leveled not at her, but at the console. "You will do nothing, Doctor," Rostova ordered, her voice shaking with the strain of her conviction. "You will stand back and let this machine do what it was built to do. We follow its logic, not our fear." "This is insane," Thorne protested. "You would risk the entire planet on a guess?" "It is not a guess," Rostova countered. "It is an inheritance. Someone, something, left this here to protect this world. They left a loaded gun on the mantelpiece. We have found a burglar climbing through the window. It is not our place to question the gunsmith. It is our place to pull the trigger." The countdown ticked past 50. The blue light from the dodecahedrons intensified, and the central energy orb began to spin, particles swirling within it like a captured galaxy. The air crackled with ozone. Petrova's mind raced, searching for a solution. She couldn't shut it down from the console. Rostova would shoot the terminal, and then they would have no control at all. A power dump was impossible. That left one option. The array was a circuit. To break the circuit, she had to physically disrupt the geometry. She had to remove one of the nodes. She looked at the platform. The energy field around it was now visible, a faint, shimmering dome of distorted air. Her sensors told her the EM radiation inside that dome was strong enough to cook flesh in seconds. It was a suicide run. But as she looked at the swirling vortex of energy, at the countdown timer ticking remorselessly toward global annihilation, she knew there was no other choice. They had woken the dragon. Now they had to find a way to put it back to sleep, even if it burned them alive. 11:45 hours, command deck. The countdown displayed 42 minutes. The conflict was no longer about data. It was a battle of wills, condensed into the oppressive, red-lit confines of the chamber. Major Eva Rostova stood firm, her pistol aimed unwaveringly at the main console, her body a physical barrier between Dr. Lena Petrova and any attempt to electronically disable the weapon. Dr. Eris Thorne had retreated to the far wall, a horrified spectator at a drama playing out on a scale he had never imagined. His world of dusty maps and careful conjecture had been immolated by this terrible, glowing reality. "Major, listen to me," Petrova said, her voice low and steady, fighting to keep the panic at bay. She was thinking like an engineer again, analyzing the problem for its weakest point. "The system is unstable. Look at the gravimetric shear." She pointed to a small, overlooked display. "The field isn't just emitting radiation, it's warping local space-time. The bunker's structural integrity is already compromised. When this thing discharges, the backlash won't just be a gamma-ray burst. It will tear the mountain apart. The blast will be registered as a seismic event on every continent." "A calculated risk," Rostova replied, her gaze not wavering. "Better than letting that thing get closer. We don't know its intent." "And we don't know the intent of this weapon," Petrova shot back. "What if it's a berserker? A self-replicating weapon that sterilizes any planet with emerging spaceflight capability? What if the ship it's targeting is trying to get here to warn us, or to disarm it? We are acting with zero information." "We have the information that matters," Rostova said, her voice dropping to an almost fanatic intensity. "Threat, weapon, solution. It's the only math a soldier needs to know." Petrova knew then that logic had failed. Rostova was operating on a different level, a paradigm of pure protocol where human judgment was a liability. She had to create a new variable. Her eyes darted around the room, cataloging her options. The main power conduits for the command deck ran through a junction box on the wall behind Rostova. They carried the 20 megawatts the array was currently drawing from the geothermal core. Overloading that junction wouldn't cut the power. The array would likely just find another source, but it would create a massive electromagnetic pulse. A localized EMP. It might be enough to momentarily disrupt the containment field around the dodecahedrons. It was a long shot, a desperate, dangerous gamble. "Thorne," Petrova said, her voice a low command. "When I move, get behind that server rack, now." Thorne, startled, looked from her to Rostova, then scrambled behind the bank of humming electronics without a word. Petrova took a deep breath. She looked at the countdown. 31 minutes. She looked at Rostova's rigid posture, at the unwavering barrel of her gun. She met the Major's eyes. "You are making a mistake, Eva." "It's not my mistake to make," Rostova replied. "It's my duty to perform." Petrova lunged, not towards the console but sideways, toward a heavy-duty fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. Rostova, surprised by the vector of the attack, shifted her aim. It was the split second of hesitation Petrova needed. She ripped the extinguisher from its housing and, without breaking stride, hurled it with all her strength at the power junction box. The heavy steel cylinder slammed into the metal panel with a deafening crash of shrieking, tortured metal. Blue sparks erupted from the junction, a shower of pure energy that lit the room with a flash of lightning. The world dissolved into white noise and chaos. The main lights exploded. The red emergency lights died. The alarms cut out, replaced by the roar of arcing electricity. For a full 3 seconds, the only light in the room was the hellish blue glow from the junction box and the pulsing heart of the array. The EMP washed over them, a silent, invisible wave of force. Petrova's comm unit died. The remaining monitors on her console fizzled and went dark. The gamble had worked. On the platform, the shimmering containment field flickered violently, its perfect dome shape collapsing into static for a precious second. That was her window. She ran, her muscles screaming in protest, her lungs burning in the ozone-choked air. She leaped onto the platform, ignoring the sudden, prickling heat that felt like 1,000 needles on her skin. The central dodecahedron, the Polaris node, floated an inch above its pedestal, held aloft by the magnetic flux. It was humming like a live thing. Without hesitating, she wrapped her hands around the ancient bronze. The pain was immediate and absolute. It was not a burn, it was a deeper violation, an electrical fire that coursed through her nerves, setting every synapse ablaze. Her vision dissolved into a kaleidoscope of fractured light. She heard a sound that was not a sound, a chorus of voices speaking a language of pure mathematics, a torrent of information pouring directly into her mind. She saw the builders of the array, beings of light and geometry. She saw the enemy they feared, a silent, consuming darkness that moved between the stars. She saw the weapon fire, not once, but 1,000 times across millennia, protecting a dozen nascent civilizations. She saw its flaw, the decay of its systems. Over millions of years, the source of the 73% failure chance. It was a guardian, but it was old, and it was dying, her muscles locked. She couldn't let go. The energy was flowing through her, using her body as a ground. She was part of the circuit now. With the last ounce of her will, she wrenched the dodecahedron from its place in the celestial pattern. She broke the circle. The effect was instantaneous. The connection was severed. The miniature sun in the center of the array collapsed in on itself with a deafening implosion of sound and light. A shockwave of pure force erupted from the platform, throwing Petrova backward. She slammed into the far wall and slid to the floor, the world going mercifully black. The remaining 11 dodecahedrons fell onto their pedestals with a series of soft metallic clinks. The light died. The sound died. The terrible, ancient energy was gone. Silence flooded the chamber, a profound and absolute stillness broken only by the crackle of the ruined junction box. She awoke to the beam of a flashlight in her eyes. Thorne was kneeling over her, his face pale with shock. "Lena, can you hear me?" She groaned, every part of her body a symphony of agony. Across the room, Rostova was getting to her feet, her pistol still clutched in her hand, her expression one of stunned disbelief. The countdown was gone. The threat was gone. They were alive. Petrova pushed herself into a sitting position, her gaze falling on her hands. The skin was red and blistered, but stranger still were the faint, silvery lines that branched across her palms and up her forearms, like Lichtenberg figures carved into her flesh. She looked at the dodecahedron she still clutched in her right hand. It was just a piece of bronze again, cold, inert, and silent. But she knew what it was. She knew what it had shown her. She was the witness. Rostova had called it an inheritance. She was right, but not in the way she had imagined. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a duty, a terrible, crushing duty that had just been passed to a new generation. The choice had been made. The weapon was disarmed, for now. But the threat was still out there, crawling through the darkness between the stars, and it was still coming. The debriefing was a sterile, bloodless affair conducted in a windowless room in Langley, Virginia. The official report, authored by Major Rostova and reluctantly co-signed by Dr. Petrova, was a masterpiece of obfuscation. It cited a catastrophic failure of the bunker's experimental geothermal power system, which resulted in a massive electrical surge, frying the sensitive equipment and rendering all captured data inconclusive. The dodecahedrons were deemed to be nothing more than what they had always been: inert bronze artifacts. The LGM-2 signal was reclassified as a previously unknown solar wind reflection phenomenon, a convenient fiction that closed the file. The mystery was officially unsolved, which, in the world of intelligence, was the same as being solved. The 12 dodecahedrons were carefully repackaged and returned to their respective museums. They were placed back in their velvet-lined drawers and glass cases, their labels unchanged. Unidentified Roman object. Purpose unknown. They sat once more in the quiet halls of history, their brief, terrifying awakening known only to 3 people. Major Rostova was promoted and transferred to a Black Ops command post, her career shielded by the wall of secrecy she had helped to build. Dr. Aris Thorne quietly retired from his position at Oxford, publishing no more papers. He spent his remaining years poring over ancient texts, not as a historian, but as a man searching for a ghost, looking for any other trace of the silent guardians who had left their weapons on Earth's doorstep. He never found one. And Dr. Lena Petrova resigned from the SETI program. The universe she had once studied with detached scientific curiosity now felt like a dark forest filled with unseen predators. She could no longer look at the stars and see mathematical beauty. She saw the silent, cloaked ship. She saw the consuming darkness it represented. She carried the truth of what the dodecahedrons were, a burden of knowledge that isolated her from the rest of humanity. The world looked the same. People went to work, wars were fought over patches of dirt, and the great, slow march of civilization continued, blissfully unaware of the cosmic drama playing out in the void. But everything had changed. History was no longer a settled account of the past. It was a living battlefield, a set of standing orders left by a long-vanished legionary. The Roman Empire, in all its glory and might, had been nothing more than a caretaker. They had found the nodes of the defense grid, unearthed them from sites far older than their own civilization. Perhaps they understood what they were, or perhaps they simply revered them as gifts from the gods, placing them in positions of honor along the frontiers of their world, unknowingly maintaining the sacred geometry of the array. They were the first watchmen in a vigil that had spanned millennia. Now the watch had fallen to a new generation. Petrova knew that the system had not been destroyed, only disarmed. The knowledge of how to reactivate it, the targeting data, the vision of the enemy, it was all seared into her memory, a permanent scar left by the circuit she had completed. She was the inheritor, the sole keeper of the most important secret in human history. The dodecahedrons were not just keys to a weapon, they were a promise and a warning. A promise that we were not alone, and a warning that we were not safe. They are out there now, scattered across the museums of the world, waiting. They are questions cast in bronze, and only one person left alive knows the terrible, universe-altering answer. The world sleeps soundly, protected by the ignorance that history has so carefully curated. But out in the cold, silent dark, a 900-year countdown continues, and the guardians of the gate are gone. The gate is now unwatched,